Hello, and welcome to this Frequently Asked Friday. Now, if you follow us on LinkedIn, you will probably know that we posted about the publication of the IVDR guidance on classification. So I think everybody's been waiting a long time to see this document, and we're really pleased to see that it's now been published. And in that post, I made a comment about encouraging people to read it and said there may be some surprises. And the question that I'd been asked was, what did I mean by surprises? So I'm actually going to run through that document with you now. I'm going to point out a few things. I think some of us who've been involved with this document for some time, we kind of got so close to it that we forget our reaction when we first saw it. And that I think most stakeholders found that there was some surprise in there. So it's a really, really critical document to the regulation. So it's really important to read and understand it. So as I say, I would very much encourage you to do that. However, we know that everybody are busy people. And so just so that you have an indication about what it includes, I'm going to just give you a very quick tour now. So I'm just going to change the technology over and start sharing my screen. You should now see the cover page of the guidance document. So the first thing to notice here is a medical device coordination group document. It's an MDCG document, and that's where you'll find it. You'll find it on the Commission website. And if you have any difficulty finding it, we'll make sure we get a link to you. So let's start by looking at what's actually in this document, what's in the table of contents. So you see there's a foreword, so that explains some of the thought processes and the background to the classification. We then have some definitions, and it talks about the principles of classification before we actually move on to looking at each rule individually with some supporting information and also some examples. So if we look at the definitions, so this is the sort of thing that you will see. So some of the definitions are not included within the IVD regulation, but they're extremely important to actually understanding the classification process. And I've just picked out one here, which is on the next page, which is life-threatening. So I know when people first started to look at the text of the IVD regulation and some of the rules talk about life-threatening, people said, but what does that mean? So the definition here is life-threatening are diseases, conditions, or situations that in general result in death. They are often untreatable, treatment options are limited, or require major medical intervention. And then there's a little footnote here, and if you follow that footnote, it will say that this is it comes from the definition in Health Canada's classification guidance document. So it's good to see that in some cases there is some convergent evolution going on and that they are compatible with each other. So always important, read the definitions. Now, if you've been to any of my training sessions, you'll know that I talk an awful lot about intended purpose. It's really, really critical to understanding and basically getting the IVD regulation right. So there's a section on that here. So it says that it's important and that the manufacturer has to clearly indicate the purpose for which the device is intended. And where there's a foreseeable risk that a device may be used for purposes which are covered by other classification rules, and that could result in a higher risk classification, you have to put a clear limitation both in the instructions for use and also in your technical documentation. And that if several classification rules or sub-rules apply, then the intended purpose of the device and its claims have to be sufficiently specified to enable a clear attribution of the class to be provided. And that if there are ambiguous claims, then the higher risk classification is going to be taken. And so it gives an example here of syphilis. So if you have a test for screening blood donations for syphilis, this is covered under Rule 1, and that makes it a Class D device. However, if your test is intended to be used to diagnose patients with the sexually transmitted disease, then it's covered by Rule 3A and it's a Class C device. So if you remain silent, then the assumption will be made that it is a Class D device. So you need to make it really clear what you intend it to be used for, and particularly if you are going to use it only for the diagnosis of individual patients, you need to actually say this is not intended to use blood donation for screening blood donations. And also you then need to make sure you sell it in a commensurate way, so you're not selling it to blood banks. So let's look at the application rules now. So the application rules start off by talking about technology and say that the classification is completely independent of technology. So I'm going to use HIV as an example here. It doesn't matter if the technology used is NAT or ELISA or even a lateral flow test. It's still used to diagnose HIV, and so therefore that's how the classification is driven, not by the technology itself. And in a similar way, the classification is also independent of the specimen type. So again, let's use HIV as an example. It doesn't matter whether it's blood or whether it's saliva. It's still used to diagnose HIV, and so therefore it's still going to fall under the same rule. So it then talks about software. So software that's actually used to drive or influence an instrument is classified in the same risk class as the instrument itself. However, if you have standalone software, and there's often a lot of standalone software these days, then it's classified in its own right according to the intended purpose. Now, if you need to determine whether you have standalone software and it actually falls under the definition of the IVD regulation, you need to look at this MDCG guidance document that was published last year. And again, you will also find that on the MDCG page within the European Commission's website. Now, it then talks about the combination of devices. I'm just going to scroll down to the next page here. So as we know, it says that the application of classification rules should be governed by the intended purpose of the device. But it then continues to say that if a device is intended to be used in combination with another device, the classification rules shall apply separately to each device. So unless you're selling it as a system, if you actually sell the assay and the controls in separate boxes, and they're not sold as a system, so every time you sell the assay, you always sell as part of that system a box of controls, then you classify them individually. So a wash buffer may be another good example here, where you may have an ELISA kit, but you actually sell a large bottle of wash solution. So you would look at the classification of each of those separately. And in a similar way, accessories are also classified in their own right. So let's go and have a look at a rule. So I've started here with Rule 1. So first of all, the guidance document repeats what the IVDR says the rule is, and then it provides you with a rationale and some colour to what is actually written in the classification rule. So you then have a rationale. So if we then move down, you will then see that there are examples, as it says here, they are non-exhaustive examples. And in this case, we're looking at the examples being hepatitis B, C, and also HIV. Now, one of the things you have to be really careful here is that at this point you may be going, well, that's Annex 2 List A, isn't it? But it's not, because this rule is not just for screening blood donations, it's also transplantation as well. And so when you're looking at the directive on tissues and cells, there is another series of analytes, for example, malaria and CMV, that you may have to consider. So if that's actually what your intended purpose is for your product. So you have a CMV test, you're intending it to be used to screen prior to transplantation, then you'll need to have the documentation that supports that, but this moves it into being a Class D device under Rule 1. And also, don't forget here that it says that also some member states may have their own specific rules. And for example, that might look at things like West Nile virus and hepatitis E virus, for example. With the IVD regulation, the devil is always in the detail. And this is why it's really, really important to actually read this particular document cover to cover to ensure that you don't have any surprises.